I'm Conservation Forestry Project Director with the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is a nonprofit conservation organization. We do land and water conservation. We work with a lot of partners, federal and state agencies, and we work with private landowners. I work out of Mobile, and most of my work is in southwest Alabama, but I grew up right here in Dale County, and I'm really excited to be here and able to share some of what I've learned over the past few years with landowners here. To make this more interesting, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to interject at any time. The more you interact, the more I think you'll get out of it, and the less talking I'll have to do. So what kind of group do we have here today? Obviously some private landowners, hopefully. Is that right?
Right. A few old folks.
Some old folks?
Yeah.
All right. Maybe some consultants? All right. And if y'all have anything to add at any time, please feel free to do so. What I wanted to talk today about is prescribed fire, and prescribed fire in the longleaf ecosystem. I wanted to start with a little bit of history on why you're hearing so much about longleaf, why agencies and nonprofits are interested in longleaf conservation and restoration and planting and burning. And it goes way back. It goes back to pre-settlement America. 300-400 years ago, when this country was beginning to be settled, you had a forest that stretched from southern tip of Virginia to East Texas that was dominated really by longleaf pine. Estimates say that maybe up to 60 million acres of that forest was dominated by longleaf, and another 30 million, which would bring the total to 90, had some longleaf component. So we're talking about a huge forest that it's really hard for me to comprehend even, how big that is. It was kind of in a swath, most of it in the coastal plain, which is toward the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast, but we have longleaf in Piedmont here in Alabama as well. There's actually longleaf in Birmingham and north of Birmingham. A lot of people think of it as a southern or a coastal species, and it's Piedmont, even you might consider it mountain longleaf type. So and that system that was here pre-settlement, it was a system that was maintained by fire, what's called a fire climax community, which means basically that the plants and animals that could handle fire we're kind of at the upper level of that system and chain. If you think about biology, people talk about ecosystems as being kind of a web where everything's interacts and everything's linked together. So a fire climax community is where all of those species are kind of kept in check by periodic fire. And research has shown through looking at scars in stumps and old trees, turpentine trees and that kind of stuff, that the average fire return interval was around 3 years. It may have been 2 to 7, or some people might say 3 to 10, but somewhere around 3 years. In that pre-settlement forest, fire was going to be back in there. And we think that there were a couple of causes that helped that fire along. Can y'all think of what those might have been?
Lightning.
Yep.
Indians.
That's it. Those are the two I've always heard. And if you think about it, it makes pretty good sense. There was virtually no infrastructure, no cities. There were villages from, the Native American tribes and stuff. But other than that, there was really nothing to stop fire. So fire would get ignited and burn for days or weeks until it hit a river or was put out by cool weather or a thunderstorm. But there were no impediments to fire, so very large areas of the landscape could burn unimpeded. And because that happened so often, fires were not detrimental. There were low light fuel loads, periodic fire, and the result was an open pine forest, which is probably what many of y'all are interested in achieving on your property. At least least that's what I would imagine if you're interested in longleaf pine. So what happened, as more settlement, more development here in the United States, people started, the view came up that fire was bad, that fire was hurting. You know, it was potentially dangerous to people's houses, you know, to people's possessions, which it could be, to towns, to timber, and other products from the forest like turpentine. So there was kind of a disconnect from people, I guess, didn't put the two together, that this system evolved over thousands of, maybe millions of years with fire. And then the mindset came that, well, fire is bad and we need to exclude it from all forest, and that's pretty much exactly what happened in the early 1900s. Over a lot of the southeast, and in particular on federal lands, Forest Service lands. How many of you are familiar with Smokey Bear? And what did Smokey Bear teach? That
You can prevent forest fire.
yeah, if you'll notice now, Smokey Bear is still around, but he's not saying forest fires. What's he saying?
Wildfire.
Wildfires. So there's kind of a shift. You know, we went from system evolved with fire to Smokey Bear era and all fire is bad, and now wildfire is bad, which it is. It can be very detrimental. So that kind of brings us to today, and we're at a point where that 60 to 90 million acre forest is down to about 3 million acres from logging and conversion to agriculture and towns and all different kinds of uses, but significantly lower than what we once had. So we're trying to reverse that trend, and we're involved in America's Longleaf, which has a goal of I think getting longleaf back up to around 8 million acres over 15 years. So anytime any of y'all put a seedling in the ground, that one extra acre helps us all achieve that goal. And private land is a huge part of us reaching that goal, because how many know the percentage of land ownership in Alabama? You folks probably know. What's the majority? The majority of the land owned in Alabama is owned by private individuals. It's about 95%, which I'm not. It doesn't really matter to me if it's private, federal. But the idea is that if we're going to do longleaf restoration conservation work here in Alabama, it's going to have to be on private lands. So that's why this type of stuff is important. That's kind of the history of fire and where we are. I wanted to talk about these two longleaf stands that we've got. The one really young one behind us, and but we'll go ahead and talk about this one here, since we're standing right here. This is, if I've picked it out right, the information I got from landowner, this is about 8 to 10 years old. There was a chemical site preparation, site prep burn, and hand planting of longleaf pine. I don't know if they were containerized or bare root. Did y'all by chance work on this property?
I do. These,
Oh.
back at the time I didn't, but these were containerized.
Okay.
leaflets.
Okay. Just in case y'all haven't heard, I wouldn't recommend, y'all might have different opinions, I wouldn't recommend planting bare root seedlings, and I think it's less and less common today. Are y'all planting any?
We're not
bare
planting
root?
any. Everything's containerized.
Survival is just, it's just so much better with
On
container
longleaf.
on longleaf.
On longleaf.
Right.
we
I
plant
should
bare root,
clarify.
loblolly slash.
Right, right. I should clarify. What I'm focusing on is longleaf. So we want to talk about prescribed fire in this stand. Some do's, some don'ts. What do you think? One thing that you always want to keep in mind when you're going to do a prescribed fire is, why are you doing it? You need to identify a question mark. I should say an objective for the fire. You need to identify a reason to come out here and do this. What are you trying to accomplish by putting fire on the ground? That should be in every burn plan, in my opinion. I would say one of the higher priorities, probably two real highly ranking objectives in this stand would be fuel reduction, although right here there's not a whole lot of fuel. Also hardwood control. They're going to burn this stand this winter, which I would say is a good recommendation. You got a relatively young stand of longleaf. It's always, I would say it's typically safer to burn in the winter. You're going to top kill a good portion of these hardwoods, but be prepared for them to sprout from that stump next spring. Shouldn't be a huge issue if you're going to continue burning this stand. I would say maybe we burn as little as every 2 years on some sites, and if they're in real good condition, we have a lot of herbaceous grasses and stuff, and it can carry fire 2 years, we'll burn it 2 years. Might take a little bit longer for the fuel to build up on this site to carry fire, but so I would say those would be your objectives. When from my experience, when longleaf is this size, it's fairly tolerant of fire. Some things that you might want to watch out for is in late spring, in April and May, you're going to see a real long bud on the top of your longleaf when they start height growth. And in April and May, that thing's going to start growing. You see, it's actually two of them up here. See that pointy thing right there? It's going to be solid white, and it might be 12 to 24 inches long.
Like a big white candle.
That's right. That's what they call it, candling. And if you burn it when that candle is sticking up like that, you're not helping yourself. You're probably going to kill a lot of seedlings. So rule of thumb, avoid burning longleaf about this. Actually, if it's about head high and it's got that candle out, I would avoid burning it. If you get later in the growing season like this one, when that bud is covered with needles, I feel a lot more comfortable burning. Another rule of thumb, when the basal diameter gets 2 inches, that's about the size of this right here, they're getting real tolerant of fire. And when they get above head high, they're getting to a height class where they're real tolerant of fire. So I'd feel really comfortable doing a winter burn in this area to achieve your objectives. And what we try to do, especially if we're burning an area that's gone without fire for a while, we'll do a couple of burns in the winter for reducing that fuel load. We're meeting some hardwood control objectives, but after that we're going to start moving our burns to the growing season. Our longleaf is taller, we'll do it in April, May, and if we want to really push the herbaceous layer and get a good response from it, it might be June, July when we come out here and burn, because some of the herbaceous species that occur here will only produce viable seed if they are burned in certain seasons or certain months. Like this area is called, in general, what's all this area called though? Starts with a W.
Wiregrass.
Wiregrass area. Wiregrass is a herbaceous plant that was once common in the longleaf forest. It's a fire. It basically loves fire. It's very flammable, but doesn't really burn. It burns hot, but not very long. So that was the dominant cover on the forest floor in this area. That's why it's called the wiregrass area. And that species will only produce viable seed if it's burned in May and June. So that's something that we ran out of time very quickly. I don't think I had my full 30 minutes. So those are some of the things you want to consider. On this younger longleaf across the road, I wanted to point out, it was, let's start easing down this way. I do a combination grid type ignition where you put little dots everywhere out there. And then you've got some head fire, you got some back fire, you got some flanking fire, and it helps keep the intensity down. But you're probably going to hear something different from every fire practitioner you talk to. They have different preferences. So I would recommend burning as soon as you can. If you're trying to maintain longleaf, you're trying to achieve that open pine habitat, which can be as soon as a year. our work in the unique habitats that we work in Alabama. Another one touches on pretty much everything I've talked about in this gentleman's comments. This was put together by the Longleaf Alliance, and it's got some very good information in it about do's and don'ts of burning young longleaf. Be sure to pick this one up if y'all don't have it.
Thank you.